This is another Read Me Something reward for Reich E. Spore's Patreon. We are reading from my Oz-based novel, Polychrome, Chapter 44. Father and those above, grant us the fortune to survive this, she thought, offering a rare prayer to the powers which they knew existed, but almost never saw. Inside, she continued the thought. Because it would be so terribly ironic for us to die here before we reach the end of the prophecy, while trying to draw attention to ourselves. The armies of Faerie parted before them, and the four crashed into the main line of the enemy. But before the forces of the usurpers could recognize the change, she saw Eric leap up 20, 30, 40 feet up, a jump that told her just how magical the entire land of Oz must be, and came down, drawing his arm back to deliver a strike to the very ground itself. She braced herself, remembering the first time he'd used that trick in the battle against Iris Mirabilis and herself. Even so, the concussion staggered her, caused the front 10 ranks of their own armies to stumble and fall to one knee. But that was the merest remnant, the backwash that the true mortal couldn't quite control. In front of him, fanning outward like floodwaters across the plains, the earth rippled, heaved itself up, and flung hundreds, thousands of the opposing army flat, sent them spinning helpless through the air, toppled siege engines like toys. At the point of impact, the ground was shattered. Eric stood alone in a dust-smoking crater, a blue indigo crystal-armored figure whose terrible power now, for a moment, had caused the entire battle to pause, all eyes staring at the inexplicable. Of all the opposing creatures caught in the earth shock, only those that flew had been unaffected. After that moment of stunned immobility, the tempests and infernos screamed in towards Eric Medon. But Polychrome found herself already in motion. Springing from the edge of the crater, she leapt into the air, dancing on spectral light to meet the first tempest with her sword. Its dark crackling blade parried her strike and then shattered to pieces. She watched, feeling almost outside herself, as Nimbus training sent her arm on a swift and sure course through the creature's center. It burst in a whirl of dark energy and fell, looking now more like a human than a monster. I killed it. The thought brought nausea to her gut even as she turned towards an inferno's blazing brightness, and she wavered for a moment, blocking the fiery blows of its weapon, but unable to bring herself to strike. At the same time, she felt that strange alien excitement rising. Below her, Eric struck twice, and 2 of the usurper's monsters collapsed, puppets whose strings of power had been severed. The penitent whirled his battle staff, and his blows struck fast and hard. She wondered, for Ruggedo seemed even more powerful, more swift and deadly than he had seemed when first they met. Movement caught her eye, one of the stone-throwing siege engines slewing around, coming to bear on Eric, and her uncertainty evaporated. 2 more blows, and the fire before her blew out, ended in smoke. The nausea was still there, but fainter, and the excitement rose, a cold and thrilling feeling of certainty that terrified her, even as it lifted her up in elation. "Eric, to your right!" she called out. His head turned, but it might be too late. The siege engine was loaded, almost aligned. "Now that shall never happen!" The clear, confident voice was Zenga's, and from the other side of the crater the Princess of Pingaree picked up and hurled one of the other toppled siege engines, through the multi-ton mystical cannon as though it were a child's toy. It collided with the one about to fire on Eric, and the 2 shattered in a black explosion that cast soldiers aside like burning chaff. "Well struck!" Ruggedo shouted, and Eric's grateful grin to Zenga was echoed in the dark-skinned girl's own brilliant smile. Just as she registered the odd fact that something about that exchange of glances bothered her, Eric looked to her, and it was gone from her mind. She saw his look, somehow knew what he was thinking. "Follow me!" he shouted to the others, and caught Polychrome as she dropped towards him, then flung her up and outwards, hurtling forward at a speed her dancing couldn't have matched. Another concussion, focused, clearing the way as she landed ahead, atop one of the dark magical engines hurling destruction at her army. She found herself laughing as she danced aside, around the defenders crewing the weapon, striking down Temblor and Torrent, Inferno and Tempest, as though they were the least of Nimbus's soldiers. The weapon itself shattered as Eric reached it, and it was not the mortal strike, but Zenga's that cleared the next path, with a boulder the size of a house. The penitent was methodically and unstoppably guarding their backs, his blows as solid as the foundation of the earth, his defenses as impenetrable as a mountain. From one mobile fortress to the next they moved, and it was like a dance, a wonderful, terrifying, perfect dance, as Eric would catch her, toss her, then return, be carried by her upwards, then down. It was as though she knew his moves and he hers before either of them spoke a word. He merely looked, and she knew where they went and what they were doing. A mob of fiery abominations swept down upon her, scorching on her cheeks. Pain of heat through even the silver armor of the above. But the pain meant nothing. She was calling out the name of her father and the Rainbow Kingdom as her sword flickered back and forth like her enemy's flames. Her shield caught their fire and quenched it with cold, mist-born light. And then the mob broke and fled screaming, many of their number already fallen before her, and the others now running in terror from the terrible true mortal whose merest touch was enough to put their fires out and still their movements, perhaps forever. That seemed almost to be a signal. The enemy army withdrew before them in ragged order, trumpets braying, "Retreat! Regroup! Fall back!" Breathing hard, a chill of victory down her spine that made her want to cheer or cry, and she knew not why, she glanced around. Eric had a few scratches, but no real injuries. Rigaud's smile from under his hood showed no pain, and the only injury Zenga seemed to have suffered was a small cut on her upper arm. Before them was the pass. Only a few siege engines, mostly abandoned now, blocked their way. In a few minutes, she thought, they would have finished. But now she became aware of something else. The enemy's army had withdrawn, but now formed up into lines, leaving a wide space through which they walked. But now the enemy soldiers were saying something, just a few at first, but then more and more, until the indistinct, rhythmic sound became louder, more forceful, and finally became a single word repeated over and over. Yoop, 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 yoop. Eric looked over at them. I'm not sure I like the sound of this. From ahead there came a booming noise, a faint shudder through the ground. Another, slightly closer, and then another, and she realized, that sounds like footsteps? Another massive footfall, another, and something moved ahead of them in the darkness of the pass, shoved aside barricades and rocks. There was an incoherent, echoing growl, and a 30-foot-high siege engine of metal and stone was suddenly thrown aside like a pebble. "Oh, crap," she heard Eric say. From the shadows within the canyon-like pass was emerging a monstrous figure, humanoid, but standing over 50 feet tall, eyes glowing a venomous yellow, skin rough and gray and stony, a shock of black hair cascading greasily across the immense shoulders. The mouth was filled with sharp, misshapen teeth, and tatters of rich clothing were draped across the mostly naked form, clinging as though they'd been stretched across something vastly too large for them. "Yoop! Yoop! Yoop!" It raised an immense spiked mace whose head was more than 10 feet across and roared. "Yoop!" it bellowed, then fixed its eyes on the little group ahead of it. "That," Rigaud said dryly, "is considerably larger than I had heard Mr. Yoop to be." "That," Eric responded, eyes still fixed on the approaching monstrosity, "is what happens when you are the abusive husband of a Yookahoo that gains enough power to teach you a lesson. The way he's walking, he's awfully solid, not just pure magic. I'm going to hurt the hell out of him if I get there, but that damn mace could do me in." "Could do any of us in, I suspect," Zenga said. "But perhaps his size will slow him down." Polychrome took a deep breath, preparing herself for this. The Yoop roared again and whirled the gigantic mace in a blur that made Zenga's hopes of slowness seem nothing but feeble, wishful thinking. It paused for a moment, studying them with a dull cunning, and Polychrome shuddered as Yoop's eyes met hers. His expression had shifted slightly, and the hunger in those eyes was nothing she wanted to imagine. And then the monster charged. "Great! Now I have to fight an armed King Kong. Where's Godzilla when I need him?" Eric leapt up and delivered another earth blow, sending out a shockwave to kick the giant Mr. Yoop off his feet. Polychrome and the others fanned out to take him from either side when he fell. But with shocking agility, Yoop hurdled the earth shock wave, leaping over it like a runner clearing a 2-foot bar, landing and swinging down with the massive mace at the same moment. Eric barely dodged out of the way and fell, knocked down this time by the shock wave created by that huge mace. Zenga pitched a boulder the size of Yoop's head at the giant, but it caught the stony missile with one hand, threw it back. The penitent was down near his feet, and Yoop gave a pained growl as the battle staff cracked against his ankle, slowing his next movements. Polychrome ran up through the clear air and cut at Yoop's head. The parrying blow of the mace nearly knocked her from the sky, and that was a hasty blow, barely in time, without any force to speak of. She was forced to back off, trying to dart in, but finding that even with her sky fairy speed, she was just not quite able to get through. Whatever they've done to him, he's no longer a giant. He's not even elemental or fairy. He's a monster with powers such as we've never seen before. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and pain. Yoop leapt in a thunderous ballet, bringing feet down to crush, swinging mace in a path of destruction, stopping and whirling to prevent any from approaching him too closely. Eric was barely able to keep out of the way. Even though he was able to cut through the magical mace with his own sword, it carried such impact the mortal was hammered to his knees by the slightest touch of the weapon. Zenga was no faster than he, and her strength did not make her invulnerable. The penitent could only evade and strike, hoping, though such hope seemed terribly forlorn, that in time the small, painful strikes would wear him down. And this is the weapon they sent with their smaller force. What abominations are waiting for us at the great castle? Polychrome didn't know what she could do. She had managed 3 cuts, the merest scratches against something like Yoop, and those only when the monstrous giant focused its attention on one of the others. Never could she get near any vital areas. And then it happened. Zenga, hefting another gigantic missile, stumbled the slightest bit, but it was enough to slow her, to make her unable to drop and dodge as the giant spiked mace whipped around towards her. And, as Polychrome knew all too well, the supernal strength granted by the pearl did not come with invulnerability. At the last possible split second, another figure barreled in, shouting, "Zenga!" and with a desperate shove sent the dark-haired princess tumbling to safety 20 feet away. But that put Eric Medon directly into the mace's path, and with not even a fraction of a second to do more than see the weapon come down. For a moment everything seemed to exist in a dreamlike slowness. She saw the monstrous spike-covered weapon hammer down on top of Eric, crushing him down and into the very rock beneath him like a fly being smashed under some immense fist. She heard herself screaming his name, felt horror rising in her, and looked up to see the wide, gloating smile on the face of Yoop. At that smile something else rose, a storm of cold silver fury, and she heard a choir of voices deep and hard around her, and the call of horns and drums resounded from the spheres, and it swept up the horror, made it part of fury and pain, and drove her forward, running on air as she had never done before, a kick to the giant's knee that made him roar in pain, dodging his grasping hand, running up the arm, a roundhouse swing of her shield that smashed the side of his head as though driven by the giant's own strength. He staggered, his roar now confused, but there was no thought in her of mercy. It was far too late for that. It was time only for judgment, and the cold silver voices echoed the fury that redoubled every time she saw the crushed stone beneath the mace Yoop no longer held. She was off his shoulder, behind him, and drove her sword in, deep, deep, and his roar was a scream now, a cry of fear, and fear spun him around faster, hand lashing out, catching at her. Now she heard laughter, cold and bitter, and a part of her shivered to realize that it was her voice, so chill and cruel, but the rest of her echoed that laugh, and her blade cut deep, cut through, and even as the giant looked in slow-witted disbelief at his hand as it came away, she was up, and hammering into Yoop's chin with all the strength this frightening, unstoppable rage had given her, then around as he reeled with one final screaming kick, tears streaming from her eyes. And with that blow Yoop was driven face first into the ground and lay still, the blood pooling from his hand and then slowing. The usurper's armies broke then, withdrawing before the charge of the armies of Faerie, and she was herself. Polychrome staggered out of the sky, running to the spot where Eric had been crying, as Zenga rose, looking at the same spot in her own rising horror. The mace suddenly quivered, and Polychrome's sobs caught in her throat, halted by impossible hope. Something catapulted the gigantic mystical weapon away like a chip in a torrent, and a silver and blue crystal armored figure heaved itself painfully out of the crushed rock surrounding it. Eric Meadon looked around, slightly unsteady, but smiled at her. He smiled. She didn't know for a moment whether she wanted to run and hug him or slap him for scaring her so. "Oh, thank the above. You're alive. I thought," she heard herself say, and heard Zenga saying something very much like it at the same time. "Ha!" Eric said weakly, but still with a pained grin. "Sorry about that, both of you, but remember, this place is about as magical as anything gets. And Yuppie there was using a really magical mace. So that looked pretty ugly to you guys out here, I'm sure, and looked pretty damn scary to me, let me tell you. But since I made sure I was focused on my true mortal defense, it really was sort of like being hit by a really big, puffy hammer of styrofoam while standing on a really deep feather bed. Hurt some from sheer impact, but it didn't break anything." He stared over at Yoop's corpse. "Who the hell did that?" "Princess Polychrome. Single-handed in the end," Nimbus said, coming up to them. Eric turned to stare at her, and she blushed and shifted. Inside, she felt an amazing, roiling, totally incompatible mixture of pride, embarrassment, nausea, shame, and confusion. "What? How the hell did you pull that off?" Eric said, and then immediately turned back to her. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make that sound. It's just that I was so worried about you getting hurt." The words brought a smile to her lips. "I was worried about that too, and you. And I don't know how I did it. I just saw you and Zenga go down, and I got so angry." Eric muttered something under his breath with a grin, something that ended what sounded like Hulk. But Nimbus was speaking. "I told you, Princess. The power of the above is in you and with you, if you find the key to unlock it. And at least for those moments, you did. Nothing on that field could have stood before you, save perhaps only our hero himself. It was well done. We have our undeniable victory. The enemy's morale is badly broken, and there will be more than sufficient witnesses to make sure they now understand we have a true mortal and other forces besides." She tried to grasp what Nimbus was saying. The power of the above? Hers? Nimbus nodded with a satisfied air. "Few were our casualties given the circumstances. Our first engagement has gone well. Now the enemy must make their moves, but we have already dictated the course of actions, though they know it not. All is arranged. Only the final act of this dark play remains."